The rallying cry of both the Renaissance and the Reformation was back to the sources. Originally, it would have been ad fontes. And what that means is back to the fount, or obviously back to the sources. What is the importance of this saying? Well, what really sparked the Renaissance and the Reformation was a handful of factors. There certainly was a handful of factors. It was growing resentment for certain institutions of authority that existed, largely the ecclesial authority of the Catholic Church, along with certain corruptions that had creeped in. Now, this isn't a video to bash on Catholics. I very much respect Catholics, and I think that Catholics have done a lot of wonderful things in upholding Western culture. So, but part of it was obviously resentment that had existed amongst a lot of people for the corruption that was going on in the church at that time period. Another thing that sparked the Renaissance and the Reformation was the influx of new literature. There was a great deal of new literature that actually had come from Greece and had come from the Greeks who were fleeing persecution from the Muslims and the Mohammedan attacks from the East. And so they moved into the West. And they brought along with them a lot of books that had been lost. Great ancient texts from Plato and all the philosophers, also a lot of church fathers. So a lot of excellent texts flowed in of great ideas that had been lost for a long time. Along with that actually came the ability for Christians in the West to actually learn to read Greek again. There was a period where Greek was largely lost to Western Christians, which is unfortunate because the New Testament was originally written in Greek, which meant that the Bible had to be read in the Latin Vulgate and not in the original Greek translation. There was also a great deal of there was also a great deal of well, there was a new piece of technology. Let's get into that. There's also a massive new piece of technology, which was the printing press, obviously. The printing press made it a lot easier to take these new documents that had recently come in and to actually print them down, because before that, scribes would actually have to sit down for months to write down one book, whereas the printing press could actually do what a scribe could do in a couple months in, I'm not sure the exact time, but it's massively less. I mean, I believe you could print multiple books per day. That would have taken, a scribe months and months to basically write out. So the time frame of of expanding literature and sending it out to people became much shorter, which meant that reading books actually became a lot more accessible to the common person. All these things put together are really the heart of what sparked both the Renaissance and the Reformation movement. Now, obviously, there are big distinctions in the Renaissance and the Reformation that exist, but the core foundational thing that brought these two to exist, and I have a love-hate with the Renaissance movement. Obviously, I also kind of have a love-hate relationship with the Reformation movement. I'm a Protestant Christian, so that is my movement, but I have a love-hate relationship with it. There was pros and there was cons to the Reformation. There's obviously problems that were going on, and I don't really think that it was the Protestants' fault fully that they were excommunicated from the church, because obviously the Protestants weren't the ones who left the church. They were kicked out of the church by the Bishop of Rome, or they were excommunicated at least. I wouldn't say they were kicked out of the church, because I don't think that, being a Protestant, I don't think that the Roman bishop has the authority to kick people out of the church for not being heretics. Obviously that's the contention. But if Protestants aren't heretics, I don't think that the Roman bishop has that authority, because I don't believe that he is the universal vicar of all of the church. Now, obviously people disagree and they have good reasons for that, and I'm not here to debate that either. I have a lot of respect for my Catholic friends and a lot of respect for my Catholic brothers, so that's not really the point of the question. The point that I'm really here to talk about is the great conversation of books. And what we really need, if we want to spark, in some sense, a new reformation, a new Renaissance sort of movement. And I think that the core thing that we can do is we need to get in touch with history. We need to get in touch with the great books, with the great minds, with the great thinkers. One of the greatest essays that I've ever read is by C.S. Lewis in his introduction to On the Incarnation. It's his essay on reading old books. To ash or not to ash? That is the question. I ashed on the table a little bit. But this lecture by C.S. Lewis is one of the most wonderful lectures I've ever read on reading old books. And one of the things that he mentions is that a lot of people, most people, when they want to study a subject like Platonism or Western history, the last thing they think of doing is picking up a volume of Plato. They don't go to the library, find a translation of Plato, and read the Symposium. Instead, they'd rather read some 10 times as long, dreary book about isms and all this sort of nonsense that's way more confusing than Plato ever was. Because a lot of people think that reading the great writers is going to be too complex. They think that they're not able to meet the great philosophers face to face. But I'll tell you, I'm an idiot, and I'm able to read the great classics. So if an idiot like me can read the classics, so can you. So if you want to really start to enter into what the Great Books of the Western World book set calls the Great Conversation, this is where you start reading the great books. You start reading all of the great figures from Western history, starting all the way back from Homer with his Iliad and the Odyssey and the Old Testament, and working your way all the way until the best modern writers. Now, really, you can't be a classic until you've had enough time to sit and see if this book is actually going to be worth reading in any time. What makes a classic is that it has stood the test of time. So obviously new books won't be classics, but the closest thing you could really start to getting to classics now, I mean, I think that, for example, I think C.S. Lewis is probably, I would consider some of his works at the level of being classics. I think that they deserve to be categorized like that. I think that you could probably bring in certain psychologists such as Freud. Freud might be worthwhile. Nietzsche. These are probably classics. These figures will probably hold the test of time. They're close enough that it's a little bit debatable if they'll hold the test of time, but I think they will. I think they've about reached classic status. But yeah, the problem is when you read modern books, you don't know if this book is actually worth reading. If it's going to be a book that's actually going to carry on the legacy of thought, because 99% of books aren't going to do that. There's a select few books that are actually have continued to carry on Western ideas and Western thought. And as an amateur, when you're reading new books, when you're reading new books, you're not in a place to judge whether or not that book is great. When you read old books, other greater minds have been able to determine that, yeah, this is a great book. So the Great Conversation is where you enter into reading these great books, and eventually, because the people who write great books usually also have read most of the great books. So when you read Plato, he's read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he's going to make commentary on these books, and his thinking, in some sense, is going to be influenced by that. When you read, obviously, Aristotle, he was taught by Plato, right? So he's going to have a lot of influence is going to be put on him from Plato's writings and from just Plato's direct teaching. And as you continue down this line, you'll see that people are commenting on the earlier ideas of writers that came before them. Obviously, St. Augustine's going to be massively influenced by St. Paul and St. Matthew and St. Luke and St. Mark. And he's going to be quoting from these texts. He's also going to be quoting from Origen and Tertullian and all these church fathers, along with quoting from ancient Greek texts and, Plato and all these sorts of figures. So when you enter into the Great Conversation, you're going to see that the books are going to start communicating with each other in some sense. And once you've read enough of them, you can start reading them in a way that has been called syntopically. When you can read a great book syntopically, and this isn't just one book, reading a great book syntopically is when you've read enough of the great books that you're able to think about how this fits into the wider conversation of great books. You're able to see, what is this book commenting on? This book is clearly commenting on, let's say that's commenting on the New Testament. You'll know that because you've read the New Testament. And you'll be able to see where these ideas and where these strands of thoughts are coming from. I mean, the New Testament is going to be the most, and Old Testament. Reading the Bible really in and of itself is going to be probably the most important book that you can read in entering yourself into the great conversation. Because if you read Milton's Paradise Lost, obviously Milton is massively influenced by the Christian story. And he was also influenced by earlier figures. I mean, you read Dante, obviously Dante was in some sense heavily influenced from the Christian story, although maybe more so by Thomas Aquinas. But Thomas Aquinas was obviously influenced by the Christian the Christian Bible. So each of these great theologians, but they're also great philosophers, and each of these great poets are going to have massive influence from the Bible. They're also going to have massive influence, though, from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romers. Wow. No, the ancient Romans. And all these works are really valuable. And when you start, there's something wonderful, though, about entering into the great conversation. And to do this, you have to find what are the best books. I would recommend, if you want to figure out what are the great books, you look at one of the traditional book sets. There's a lot of these old book sets, and you don't have to buy the book set. I mean, I have the Great Books of the Western World book set. I've been working through it. It's wonderful. Look at what books are in the Great Books of the Western World book set, though, and then see what books seem interesting to you, and start trying to find one that would interest you, and then read those books. It doesn't have to be from that book set. Just find the books that are in that book set. You can also do that with the Harvard Classics as another great collection of classics, but just find one of these classic book sets, find the list, and then find a book that you're interested in reading. You can also, obviously, if you read one of the great authors, let's say you read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which is a great book, you can see what books they talk about, what books influence them. They'll talk about books. It's one of those things that's really interesting. Whenever you read a great book, not every time you read a great book, but most great books that you read, they're going to talk a lot about a lot of different books. And you'll think, what books influenced this writer? Because this guy's obviously great. I'm going to go back and read those books now. But I mean, obviously, for example, Benjamin Franklin's going to quote the Bible all the time. He wasn't an Orthodox Christian by any means, but he always was quoting the Bible. He's going to talk a lot about Socrates, which we know about Socrates from Plato. And he's going to talk about the great philosophers and all these great books in his autobiography. I mean, the amount of time that he spends talking about books is probably like 20% of the book. That's probably like 20% of his biography is him talking about books that he read. So that can show you how really important these books were to. How important these books really were to the great thinkers. So yeah, I mean, just start entering into the great books. It is worth your time. It will be difficult at first, but you will find that reading the great minds, reading the great thinkers is actually a lot easier than reading the modern scholars who talk about these people. The reason that these books are the great books is because not necessarily just the common man, but the commonly educated man who is capable of at least literacy was able to gain a great deal from these books. Now, it doesn't mean that they could gain everything from these books. It takes a lot of times reading these books. And obviously, the more educated you are in reading, the more you'll gain from a book in one reading. But you have to read great books multiple times, and that's fine. You need to read widely, but you also need to go back and reread great books. I'm not saying go back and reread a book that wasn't worth reading in the first place. I'm saying if this book is one of the greats and it really deeply impacted you, go back and read it. Because the first time I read a book, it's like getting hit with a waterfall. I don't know what's happening. It's just kind of like it flows past me, and it's just like I experienced the book. After you've read the book like that once, then you can actually go back and start pulling apart the text, seeing what's actually going on in the book. And that's part of the power of, that's part of reading. That's part of actually being literate. C.S. Lewis says that the sign of a non-literate man is that he only reads books once. Books are not a gum wrapper. You don't just take the gum out and then chew it up and then you throw away the wrapper. No, books are something that you read and you reread and you re-enjoy. I mean, obviously one of the greatest political thinkers of modern history was, and whatever you think of him, was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln read, I believe, 3 books really in his lifetime. There's only 3 main books that he read, but he read them very, very deeply. And the books that, and I don't know if this is true, this could be hearsay, but I do believe this is true. He read the Bible in King James Version. He read the works of Shakespeare, and he read Euclid's Geometry. Those were the 3 works that Abraham Lincoln largely read. That was it. And obviously, he was a great thinker. I mean, if you read his speeches were excellently put together. He was an excellent speechwriter. Obviously, he was elected as president because people thought that he was, they thought that he was a figure that was at least skilled enough as an orator to gain the applause of the majority of the American nation. And when you read, for example, the Gettysburg Address, that's an excellent work. I mean, the way that he ties together the ideas of Benjamin Franklin, or not Benjamin Franklin, but why am I forgetting here? Let me try to think. I'm gonna take a Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, the way that he pulls the ideas of Thomas Jefferson in the Gettysburg Address into his speech is an excellent piece of rhetorical skill. Where he ties that idea of all men being created equal in the sight of God, back to the Declaration of Independence. That's excellent. And you can be greatly educated from reading a few great books extremely deeply. But obviously people like Thomas Jefferson read hundreds of great books. Not hundreds even. He read thousands and thousands of great books. He was a very literate man. If you hear about, like Thomas Jefferson would sometimes read for up to 14 hours a day. Think about that. I don't have that much patience. That's crazy, actually, reading up to 14 hours a day. These guys were clever and they were literate. And reading the Founding Fathers is actually a great way to see what somebody who is classically educated actually looks like. Because the Founding Fathers were these rural backwoods farmers in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by tribes of warriors who rode around on horses and painted their faces and, fought. And they were warriors. This is a savage, barbaric culture that, surrounds them. And a lot of the Westerners aren't all that much more civilized. But the Founding Fathers, they were well off. I will give them that. It's not like they were the lower class. They were the upper class of the American nation, but they were, on the border of the British Empire. They were really not the cream of the crop of Western society. The aristocrats, at least as it would have been seen by the British at that time, were the ones who actually lived in Britain. These guys were like the backwaters aristocrats. But, they ran giant plantations. But these guys were intelligent. These guys were smarter than most modern scholars. They make most modern scholars look really, really stupid. And it's because they were classically educated. They read the great books. So, I think that it's just something that we've really lost is this idea of reading the great books. But if we're going to have great men come back, I mean, if we want a new Renaissance, if we want a new sort of Reformation, we need to read the great books. That's the only way it's going to happen. We need to look back before we can look forward. We need to consider what the great minds before us had to say, and then we need to expand on that. But we've forgotten that. We've decided nowadays that instead of actually, looking back to what the greats built, it's like, imagine your ancestors built a massive cathedral, right? And they'd spent generations after generations. They'd spent hundreds of years building this cathedral. And you said, I don't really like that cathedral very much. I'm not going to build on it anymore. I'm going to go build a little mud hut, and that's going to be my place of worship. You'd be like, why? Keep building the cathedral. You look at it, it looks beautiful. We're working on it. It's massive, it's stone, and you're going to build a little mud hut that's going to get washed away. Like, just go back to the cathedral and work on the cathedral. Stop building a little mud hut. Yeah, I don't know if you're going to get my analogy there. I don't even know if I get my analogy there, honestly. My point is, though, in the modern day, we try to start everything from scratch. instead of building a philosophy that's based upon the philosophies that came before, and then we expand upon them, instead we just try to tear everything down. We don't really consider what came before us. Instead, we just focus on what we want to do now, without any thought for what happens in the future, and for any thought that happened in the past. I mean, what makes us greater than the animals? The animals can't consider the past. They don't know what came before them. And they don't understand that something's going to come after in the future. They can't comprehend that. What makes man so great, what makes us so excellent over the beasts, is that we are able to consider the past and the future. And we are able to take the wisdom of the past and apply it to today. The foolish person makes mistakes that the wise figured out 2,000 years ago. And if you knew the wisdom of the past, you would be able to just not make the mistakes that you make. I mean, I think that's the issue of heretics a lot of times. And, I'm a Christian, so obviously my view of what a heretic is, for example, a non-Trinitarian. No offense to non-Trinitarians. I actually know a lot of great non-Trinitarians who are very nice people, very lovely people, but they are heretics. And, I'm going to call a circle a circle. So, the problem is that a lot of the heretics are just making mistakes that great saints like St. Athanasius disproved these heresies over almost 2,000 years ago. Not quite 2,000 years ago. It was about Nicene Creed is let me think, about 1,600 years ago, right? St. Athanasius was disproving a lot of these heresies 1,600 years ago, and other saints disproved other heresies. But a lot of these heresies still exist because you didn't go back and read the great thinkers. You didn't see why these ideas were disproved, why no actual major theologian of the modern day of the Christian church believes these things anymore, besides some fringe people. Why? It's because they were clearly disproved a long time ago, but you're going back and you're making the same mistakes of the past. So I think that's one of the big problems of the modern day, is that we basically tried to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I think that we can go back. I don't think we need to actually give up Western society. I think that Western civilization is going to stand whether we like it or not, but it's our mission to bring it back. And I think that we are going into what feels like a dark age, but it could be the beginning of a new rebirth, I hope. Why do I think that? Well, the reason that I think that we could be going into a new rebirth, no, I'm not certain, is because there's a new technology. Now, we actually have access to the old books, and I think that's important, that we actually look back at the old books. I think that's the only way we're actually going to have massive cultural expansion in any way that's going to be valuable, that's going to last for the ages. But we have this new piece of technology that's very similar to the printing press in a lot of ways, because its power is that it's expanded the ability to bring information into the world. And that is obviously, what are you watching me on? You're watching me on the internet. The internet may be the new printing press. It's a very powerful technology that has given, obviously, stupid people like me the ability to blabber on. Just like it's given the ability of stupid people way back in the day. The printing press gave stupid people the ability to write books that people could read. And smart people, too. The internet may be the new printing press. And considering that factor, I think there is a chance. But it needs to be the internet needs to be a tool that helps people not distract themselves, because that's what the internet has become. It needs to become a tool that makes people deep in history, deep in the great ideas, deeper in thinking, if we're going to actually save Western civilization. So that's pretty much all my thoughts. I think I'm pretty much done with this video. So thank you for watching, guys. Have a great day. Goodbye.